Welcome to AEIOU, a podcast about Austria. I'm Andrew, your host. In the last episode, we discussed the decision of history's most famous Austrian to use his position as Chancellor of Germany and head of its Nazi party to overthrow the authoritarian regime of Engelbert Dollfuss, Chancellor of Austria. This coup attempt has become commonly known as the July Putsch. We know the intentions of the July Putsch in part because of the so-called Kollerschlag document, which was found on an Austrian SA member attempting to cross the border back into Germany after the coup attempt failed. Although the document was coded, the SA member was carrying the key as well, which was also found during the search. While tactics on the first stage of the putsch are lacking, the strategy is clear. Dollfuss was to be deposed as chancellor, and the period of inertia that followed his resignation would be used for the SA to seize power. Ultimately, the tactic chosen to force Dollfuss's resignation was an armed attack on the chancellery in Vienna. This attack was carried out by a special unit of the Schutzstaffel, or SS, the SS Standarte 89, which itself had been an Austrian SA unit until a couple of months earlier. The coup leaders had believed that, in striking at the particular time and date chosen, they would seize not only the chancellor but also his entire cabinet, which was scheduled to meet at the time. In addition, it was known that the vice-chancellor, Ernst Rüdiger Starhemberg, who was also a prominent figure in the Heimwehr independent right-wing militia, was in Italy on a state visit, so he would not be able to take over the government in his absence. Events did not unfold as intended. A large proportion of the responsibility for this failure in planning falls to Johann Dobler, a Vienna police inspector and member of the Austrian Nazi Party. Dobler developed pangs of conscience on the morning of July 25th and reached out to Emil Fay, the previous vice-chancellor under Dollfuss and a current minister without portfolio, as well as a prominent Heimwehr leader. Although Dobler was not able to reach Fay, he met with Karl Vrabel, an aide to Fay, at a Vienna cafe later that morning and alerted him to the coup to take place that day. Vrabel subsequently made contact with Fay, who warned Dollfuss. Dollfuss in turn dismissed the cabinet and tried to mobilize police to beat back the coming attack. When the assault team arrived at the chancellery between noon and 1 in the afternoon, Dollfuss was shot twice almost immediately at close range and bled to death over the course of the next 2 hours. Angry at having been foiled in seizing the whole cabinet and specifically mad at Dollfuss, who refused to resign, the SS men with him refused to call a priest to administer the last rites of the church. As these events unfolded elsewhere in the city, the President of the Republic, Wilhelm Miklas, named as Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg, then serving as foreign minister. He made this appointment because, as noted, Starhemberg was not in the country. At the same time, Fay mobilized the Heimwehr and police against the coup leaders who surrendered before 7 that evening. Dollfuss's assassination notwithstanding, the first stage of the coup, the attempt to decapitate the government, had failed. The question is why. According to historian Julie Thorpe, it failed because the Nazis had misjudged the nature of Austria's authoritarian right wing. She writes, quote, Austrian proponents of a pan-German identity claimed that the Austrian state was the fullest expression of German hegemony over non-German nationalities and of a German historical mission in Central Europe, end quote. Consequently, while the Nazis might have seen the Christian social electorate as sympathetic on the basis of its fascist authoritarianism and pan-Germanism, they misjudged the specifically Austrian-Viennese nature of this ideology. Moreover, the loyalty of the Heimwehr, to whom Dobler as informant reached out, was emblematic of this erroneous assessment by the Nazis. In May 1930, the Heimwehr had publicly sworn the so-called Korneberg Oath, which included explicitly fascist and pan-German expressions of its ideology. The following year, the Austrian Nazis and the Heimwehr organization in the federal state of Styria formed a Kampfgemeinschaft, or fighting alliance. Here the Nazis seem to have misjudged the Heimwehr as a whole on the basis of the actions of its Styrian wing. Nazi ideology in Austria was always more popular in regions of Austria bordering non-German nations, including Styria, Burgenland, Carinthia, and parts of Tyrol. Believing that the sympathies of the Styrian Heimwehr existed in the Heimwehr in places like Vienna or Salzburg was a fatal miscalculation. Finally, there was a miscalculation on the Nazis' part with regard to their own organizations. As noted a moment ago, while the SA was the primary armed organization executing the coup nationwide, It was a former SA unit now subordinated to the SS that began the assault in Vienna. Importantly, less than 1 month before the July Putsch, the SA had been violently purged in Germany on the famous Night of the Long Knives of June 30th, 1934. Anger about the purge had spread to the SA in Austria. As noted by the prominent German historian Peter Longerich, quote, although the Austrian SA had promised the plotters its support in principle, the Viennese SA failed to come to the assistance of their unpopular SS comrades, end quote. We know that the coup leaders in Vienna attempted and failed to seize a radio station in Vienna on July 25th, from which they would have broadcast news of Dollfuss's removal from office as a signal for SA units throughout Austria to seize power on a local basis. On this point, the Kullerschlag document states, on news of Dollfuss's resignation, the entire SA will immediately and without further instructions undertake unarmed propaganda marches for the purpose immediately occupying public offices and buildings in the provincial capitals and local administrative centers and of seizing power. Elsewhere, it is stipulated armed confrontation with the police or gendarmerie is preferably to be avoided for as long as possible. Where it proves necessary, however, it is to be carried out with the utmost vigor and maximum forces. Clashes with the federal army are to be avoided if at all possible, end quote. This stage of the coup failed as well. Part of this failure can be attributed to Nazi misjudgment of the sympathies of the Heimwehr, which was mobilized with the Austrian army nationwide against the Nazis. However, the reasons for the failure of the coup in the provinces ran deeper. Writing to the German Foreign Ministry on July 31st, just 1 day after the coup was put down finally, Hans Steinacher, head of Volksbund für das Deutschtum im Ausland, a Berlin-based government organization dedicated to engendering German unity outside of Germany's borders, laid out the reasons for the coup's failure. After indicating the mistakes of staging the coup while the vice-chancellor was out of the country and of not preparing an option to abort the plan, Steinacher remarked, the masses are lacking. We are unable to prove that they exist, and at the moment when the matter was becoming really dangerous, Italy intervened, end quote. Clearly, there was no popular support for the Nazi coup beyond the Nazi party itself. Here, the assassination of the chancellor itself seems to have been a key mobilizing factor. As noted above, Dollfuss had not been allowed by the SS to receive last rites. This information was transmitted to the deeply Catholic Austrian population via newspapers both domestically and internationally before the coup attempt was even completed. The historian Philip Scheriau writes, quote, Dollfuss is represented in the newspaper coverage as a martyr in two primary ways. On the one hand, he is a hero who fell in the fight for his country, and on the other hand, he is represented as a hero and martyr in the Christian tradition, end quote. Beyond this reporting, Dollfuss had enjoyed the support of the Austrian Catholic Church for his authoritarian policies. Not only was one of Dollfuss's most popular predecessors as Chancellor Ignaz Seipel a Catholic priest, but Seipel had actually contributed to the creation of the Heimwehr that defended the Austrian state against the Nazis. Moreover, Dollfuss's funeral mass held on July 28th before the coup was over was said by the Archbishop of Vienna, Cardinal Theodor Innitzer, and was attended by 500,000 faithful. Those Austrians not already put off by the Nazis' anti-clericalism were surely disgusted by the reports of how Dollfuss had died, and if their sense of being Austrian was not offended, their Catholicism was. As indicated in the aforementioned letter from Hans Steinacher to the German Foreign Ministry, the final reason the July Putsch failed was the threat of Italian intervention. Misjudgment of how Mussolini would react to the coup attempt was the final miscalculation of the Nazis in June 1934. Not only was Vice-Chancellor Starhemberg in Italy at the time of the Putsch, but likely unbeknownst to the coup leaders at the time, so were Dollfuss's wife and children. Mussolini's reaction to the Putsch was deeply personal, and he mobilized Italian army troops to the Brenner Pass and Italy's border with Carinthia, in a clear threat of intervention if the Nazis did not stand down. It was largely on the basis of this threat that Hitler withdrew support for the coup, and it collapsed. However, it also seems that there was a miscalculation by the Nazis of the Austrian position on Italy as well. There was a not insignificant number of right-wing Austrians who resented Italy's annexation of South Tyrol at the end of World War I. Hitler, for his own part, had recognized Italy's claims to the territory as a way of appeasing Mussolini, for whom he had great respect. In June 1934, Hitler and Mussolini had met for the first time in person in Venice. At this meeting, Mussolini had made clear his support for Dollfuss and for Austria's independence from Germany. That the coup went forward 6 weeks later would seem to be a grave error on Hitler's part. The irredentist positions of the Austrian far right undoubtedly played a role in this error. Given the resentment about South Tyrol, both in the Nazi Party and in the Heimwehr, it could have been believed that a Nazi seizure of power in Austria would create sufficient momentum for the reclamation of South Tyrol, or at least provide enough of a show of force at the Italian border that Mussolini would think twice before intervening. Here the Nazis seem to have misjudged Dollfuss, himself initially an irredentist on South Tyrol, and his own willingness to compromise on the matter in exchange for Mussolini's support. As the historian Gottfried Karl Kindermann has argued, this guarantee of independence was stipulated in a secret attachment to the Rome Protocol of 1934, signed among Italy, Austria, and Hungary as a hedge against German aspirations of continental hegemony. In essence, Dollfuss had conceded South Tyrol in exchange for Italian military protection. While this concession did not save his life, it did save Austria, at least for the time being. It did not, however, save Dollfuss. Nevertheless, despite a characteristically short term in office, the martyred chancellor had utterly transformed Austria. How that country would fare under its new chancellor, Kurt Schuschnigg, is part of what we'll discuss in the next episode. Thanks for listening.